So for those of you who might just have logged on, my name is Elsa VA, and we just spent the morning together and we heard some fabulous presentations. We heard from Dawit Benti, an overarching message of looking at geography, space, architecture, and the global trends in order to understand climate crisis on the continent. And Jim's Boyce, a key message of holding big power and big money accountable. And so I have the distinct pleasure to introduce Vanessa Nakate, and the section inspired by Vanessa Nakate. And Vanessa Nakate's work follows so importantly and beautifully and crucially with the morning that we just had in understanding the crisis. So it's a great honor to have you here with us, Vanessa. Because your voice rises loud and clear for the kinds of policies and practices that would actually affect change. Your global work against climate change needs no introduction, but I do want to highlight some aspects of your work. Vanessa Nakate was appointed UNICEF Goodwill Ambassador in 2022 and appeared on the cover of Time magazine in 2021. And you have addressed world leaders at multiple climate summits. You have begun advocating for climate justice since 2019 with protests on the streets of Kampala, Uganda, where you are currently located, and continue to protest every week, becoming the very well-known face of the global movement against the climate crisis. In 2020, and we will learn a little bit more about this in more detail, you were cropped out of a news photo in which you appeared alongside Greta Thunberg and the white climate activists. And the response of the news outlet was, I didn't just erase a photo, you erased a continent. And that made international headlines. You have since, Vanessa, used your platform to advocate for climate justice for every community, especially those most affected by the impact of climate change, which is what our previous speaker was also talking about. You founded the Rise Up movement to elevate the voices of African climate activists, as well as to install solar panels in rural Ugandan schools. You are an author of A Bigger Picture, a manifesto on inclusive climate action. So we are so honored to have you here today, Vanessa. It is just such a pleasure, and we look forward to learning from you. The way we have organized this session is as follows. So in the chat box, I'm going to drop an agenda. And we want to make sure that Vanessa's work is contextualized for everybody. So we're first going to start by watching the Global Opportunity to Accelerate Africa's Sustainable Future, which is a conversation between Vanessa and Mary Robinson, the former president of Ireland, as part of the TED Women series. And then we will have a chance to hear from Vanessa Nakate directly and have a Q&A with her. And then at the end of that conversation, we will have a few questions for you, the audience, for you to be engaging with this content. And I will share the teaching resources, which I also have linked in the chat box right now for you. So Vanessa, it's a pleasure to have you here. And without further ado, I'm going to share the video of you so that the audience can learn more about your life and your work, and then we will turn to a conversation with you.
Okay. Okay.
No, I'm so sorry. I can't find my, there we go. I was speaking this whole time thinking you were hearing me. My apologies, everybody. Vanessa, thank you for these powerful words. Thank you for so eloquently inviting us into ways of thinking about ourselves and ways of thinking about the struggle on the continent. I'm very moved by your thinking and your actions and your invitations to us. So I'm going to turn it over to you to say a few words. It's really an honor to have you with us. And after you're done talking for a few minutes, we'll open it up for questions, which you can write in the chat box or ask to Vanessa directly. Thank you for being here, Vanessa.
Thank you very much. Very happy to be here and to speak to all of you. Thank you for taking the time to watch the video. And I'll also take this time to share one of the things that I've seen with my very own eyes. So last year in September, I spent a few days with UNICEF in Turkana County in the Horn of Africa to meet with people who are suffering from the historic drought that is wreaking havoc on communities there. Turkana County and other parts of the Horn of Africa have suffered 4 consecutive failed rainy seasons, and the drought is killing crops. There is no pasture for the livestock, and water sources are drying up everywhere. And forecasts suggest that the next rains are likely to fail too. The ongoing emergency in the Horn of Africa is depriving children of clean water, of food, or even livelihoods and access to life-saving health services. It is keeping them from the classroom and forcing their families to move. The climate crisis is not robbing them of their futures. It is robbing them of their present. It is robbing them of their very survival. And over those days, I spent time with people who have literally done nothing to create the climate crisis, but who are suffering its worst impacts. I spent time with mothers who are desperately trying to keep their young ones alive, trying to find food and water to sustain their families' lives for another week, for another day, and even another hour. I spent time with their children who are clinging to life. And I do want to tell you about one of the people I had the chance to meet while I was in Turkana County in the Horn of Africa. I met a young boy in a hospital where the worst cases of severe acute malnutrition are referred and treated. It was devastating for me to see, especially when there are available solutions that can be put in place to stop children from suffering like this. Unfortunately, this child's family was not able to access the proper services in time for him to receive the treatment that he needed. And by the time the sun set that evening, sadly, he had passed away. This is one story about how the climate crisis is affecting people all around the world, especially in the global south. This is the face of the climate crisis. It is not some distant future threat. It is already here. And one of the most heartbreaking aspects of the unfolding crisis is the injustice of it all. Africa is responsible for less than 4% of global emissions. The entire continent of Africa, 54 countries, just 4%. For perspective, the US is responsible for about 25% of global emissions. So while Africans like that little boy in Turkana County have played no part in creating this emergency, we are the ones bearing the brunt of the worst impacts. The African Development Bank states that Africa is the most vulnerable continent to climate change impacts. The World Health Organization announced that 1 in 3 people across Africa are facing water scarcity. The World Bank announced that by 2050, 86 million Africans will be forced to leave their homes and try to find somewhere else to exist. And after years of failed rains, the World Food Programme says that 22 million are at a risk of famine across the Horn of Africa. While the frequency and intensity of extreme weather events is now a global phenomenon, it's much harder for people in the poorer, more vulnerable countries of the global south to recover from these devastating droughts, storms, and floods. A group of scientists announced that we have likely already approached 5 disastrous tipping points. These include the collapse of the Greenland's ice cap, eventually producing a huge sea level rise, the collapse of a key current in the North Atlantic, disrupting rain upon which billions of people depend for food, and an abrupt melting of carbon-rich permafrost. They went on to say that if we exceed the 1.5 degrees Celsius threshold, we are likely to blow past 5 more climate tipping points. Most scientists believe we are already nearing 1.3 degrees Celsius. Keeping global temperatures average below 1.5 degrees Celsius would require, among other things, an immediate and massive reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. The IEA, that is the International Energy Agency, announced that we can have no new fossil fuels if we are to keep global temperatures below 1.5 degrees Celsius. The United Nations Secretary General, Mr. Antonio Guterres, has repeatedly said that any new investment in fossil fuels would be economic and moral madness. And yet leaders from the global north countries who are responsible for the vast amount of emissions which are hitting our planet are breaking their climate promises. We face catastrophic tipping points, a clear signal that we must have no new oil and gas. People from poor countries are suffering and dying, and people from rich countries who have long benefited from fossil fuel extraction still feel they need more coal, oil, and gas, regardless of what that might mean for the people in vulnerable countries. We know that big oil and gas companies are pretending that we need new fossil fuel development in Africa to lift people out of energy poverty. It is true that energy poverty is still hurting millions of people in Africa and across the global south. In sub-Saharan Africa alone, around 600 million people still don't have basic access to electricity. But I want to be clear about this. Big oil and gas companies have been promising to lift people out of energy poverty for decades. It's a lie. It's always been a lie. The pipelines and power lines from coal and oil and gas plants, they will never reach those who live at the last mile, and these corporations know this. The oil and gas that fossil fuel companies want to develop in Africa will not be for Africans. That oil and gas will be loaded onto ships and get shipped to Europe. And the profits from that new fossil fuel development will line the pockets of people who are already very rich. And when that new fossil fuel infrastructure has to become obsolete in the next couple of decades, the resulting debt will suffocate Africans who are already drowning in existing debt. The only way to lift people out of energy poverty is through distributed renewable energy. That is the cheapest, fastest way to get energy to people living at the last mile. So we need to put this lie of fossil fuels being a bridge for Africa. Because if we want to call fossil fuels a bridge, then we must be very clear. Fossil fuels are a bridge to nowhere, or maybe somewhere even worse, because the climate crisis is already here. We may all be facing the same storm, but we are in different boats. Poor communities, global south communities, communities of people who look like me, they are in very small boats, overcrowded boats, boats with many holes, boats that could capsize easily. But I do know that in our fight for climate justice, we must put people at the center of addressing this crisis, because climate change is more than weather. It's more than statistics. It's more than numbers or calculations. It's about the people. With every statistic that you hear, with every number that you hear, there is a face behind that. There is a child, there is a mother, there is a person behind that. That is why we must take care of people. We must take care of vulnerable communities. We must take care of the planet for the generations who are still to come. I believe that we must move from glory to glory. We cannot leave the planet worse than the way we received it. We must hand over a planet that is better than what we received from the previous generations. But above all this, we must put people and justice at the center of our conversations. Thank you.
Very good, very good. Very provoking.
Thank you so much, Vanessa, for this really important and powerful message and invitation to all of us. I want to open it up right now to questions, comments, reactions in the chat box, or to unmute to raise your hand if you'd like to speak. So Dia, I saw that you just raised a hand, and I think I can't see you anymore.
Oh, I'm right here.
Oh, go ahead. Why don't you unmute yourself and speak directly?
Yeah, I think I'm unmuted right now. Thank you, young lady, for very, very interesting view on climate change and social justice, or justice in respect to climate change. And I'm sure you've had people present this question before. There's a big argument here in the United States about whether climate change is all man-made or partially man-made, and who's responsible. And clearly you said, generally speaking, based on the numbers, that Western countries, the United States, for instance, 25%, and I didn't get the figure for Europe, but on the other hand, Africa as a whole, with 54 countries, are just 4%. So what I wanted to ask you is the same question that maybe some of your detractors may ask you. Do you believe that climate change is man-made, partially man-made? And if so, partially, how much of it is man-made and how much of it is just natural occurrences?
Thank you very much for the question. Basing on the science that I have, read and listened to as well, I believe that climate change is definitely man-made, and the burning of fossil fuels has greatly contributed to the rise in global temperatures, to the rise in the emissions. And personally, in school, I'd like to mention that I studied business administration and majored in marketing. So my journey of activism has really been a journey of learning many of these things from scientists and fellow activists. So yes, what we are facing right now is man-made, but also it has a man-made solution. And that is no new fossil fuel investment. That is, ensuring that our ecosystems, biodiversity, nature is restored and protected. That is ensuring that our forests are protected. It's really understanding the different aspects of the environment that we must all, work towards. Even agriculture itself, we know that agriculture is greatly, responsible for a percentage of emissions, transportation, name it. So we have to really address the different sectors of our lives that are contributing to this crisis, and how we can make them as sustainable as possible. But from the science and from the International Energy Agency, they have been very clear that if we are to limit global temperatures below 1.5, then we cannot have any new fossil fuel investments, that is for coal, oil, and gas. And many times people will say, but if you're saying no new fossil fuel investment, what are people going to do about energy needs? And that is where renewable energy, scaling up of renewable energy comes in. And that is the balance. I believe that, we live in a very balanced world. So if we take out, no new fossil fuels, what balances that is yes to renewables.
Thank you so much for your answer.
You're welcome.
I hope you hear me.
Franklin, we hear you. Thank you.
Okay. It's a Herculean task, I would say, in terms of your efforts so far, what you have demonstrated, you've done in Uganda and particularly, to the entire world. My question basically is, how are you adapting or coping with the politics of your efforts?
Can you make it more clear, please?
Okay, well,
yes.
You know that the government has a role to play in the decisions as far as these, whether we want to talk about renewable energy or using fossil fuel. So your campaign is very, very important, to the crusade. And I'm just wondering, particularly in Uganda, how are you coping with the politics or the debate, the political debate about what you're doing? Because you're talking about you need financial support in order to carry one thing out or the other. But what is the role of the government of Uganda, for example, in supporting your effort or frustrating your effort? That's just what I wanted to know, because that transcends to a whole lot of other countries.
Well, yeah, thank you for that question. I would say that, what I've seen with the government is very strong on adaptation. It's very strong on, ecosystems, restoration, and protection. However, we still have a pipeline that is in plan to be constructed. So I think more of the challenge that we faced as activists is that, we are saying no new fossil fuels if we are to limit global temperatures below 1.5. But then we have the East Africa crude oil pipeline that is to go from Uganda to Tanzania. So of course, that has caused a number of challenges for many activists, being arrested and, being asked not to talk about the pipeline and why, Uganda and Tanzania need the pipeline. And I think, this is a challenge for many, activists, not just in Uganda, but activists across Africa, because there is, this conversation around the Western countries developed on fossil fuel extraction. So even African countries need to do the same. So it's kind of been a challenging situation for many activists to say that Africa can actually develop and build the economies of the nations without investing in fossil fuels. We can actually invest and scale up renewables that can boost the economy and the different sectors. So there is just this challenge of, our leaders and even the people within our countries, some of the people saying, but the Western countries developed on fossil fuels, why shouldn't African countries do the same? We think that, Africa has an opportunity of showing climate leadership and leading on scaling up renewable energy. Because again, like we say, what happens in Europe or what happens in the Arctic, or what happens in the United States doesn't end there. If there is burning of fossil fuels somewhere in a coal mine or an oil field in Europe, we see the countries that are being impacted the most. And it will be the same thing if there is, burning or fossil fuels within Africa. It's still going to be African countries that are going to be impacted the most. We know that many people don't have the resources that they need to cope with the climate crisis. We cannot afford environmental destruction. Now, with the pipeline in Uganda, we know that it will go through a number of, environmental, a number of habitats for wildlife, a number of rivers as well, which could be harmful to the people that benefit from, these rivers or these water sources. So it's been very challenging for many activists, and I think it's going to continue being a challenge for activists in Africa to actually say that Africa can build its economies on renewable energy without us being told, but Europe or the United States did this and this, so we should also do this and this. So I think that's why there is a need for climate finance to really, double on adaptation efforts, but also to double on mitigation. Because if there is no investments in renewable energy, in African countries, we know that African countries are trying to also lift, their people out of energy poverty. So if there is no investments in renewables, then there is these oil and gas companies that are bringing investments in fossil fuels and in oil or gas in Africa. So it's kind of a challenging situation for activists, not just in Uganda, but I believe in different parts of Africa, to say that we cannot have any new investment for the sake of the people and also for the sake of the planet. And we also know that many of these resources, in a few years, are going to become stranded assets, which are going to add on debt that many African countries are already, facing. So it's really hard, even being in a place of, or the citizens of your country saying you are being an enemy of economic progress. So it's really a challenging thing to say that no new fossil fuels. I remember in school when, that primary school, when I first discovered, oil in Uganda, and we used to be examined about it, like, how is this going to be helpful? And of course, with what we were told, we always knew this is going to bring, economic development. This is going to be a source of jobs. So I understand, when people feel that they, extraction of oil is going to bring economic development, because I've been in that place where I thought that, that is what it would do. But, as I've grown up and also learning from the different people, from science, fellow activists, I've seen how, even the countries within Africa that have massive fossil fuel development, they're still having their people living in extreme poverty, people not having basic access to electricity. And it goes back to what I said, that many times, this energy, it's loaded onto ships, and it is to heat up countries within Europe. We saw with when Russia invaded Ukraine, we saw that many, countries within Europe started to say they're not going to, buy Russian gas again. And then they started to look for Africa for their own energy needs. And I've been at conferences, within Europe where, I am from Uganda, I'm from Africa. And instead of being asked to talk about the energy needs of the African continent, I'm constantly being asked to talk about the energy needs of Europe and how we should keep the lights on in Europe. But many people don't realize that lights have been off on the African continent for decades. And no one has been talking about how this is an energy crisis. So you even realize that even the investments for gas that are being discussed in Africa, the gas is going to be, it's going to be for the benefit of the energy needs of the people in Europe. It's sad, but it is the truth. The people at the last mile will never have access to that energy or that electricity. That's why I believe that distributed renewable energy is what African countries need. And this will be able to reach even the person at the last mile.
Well, thank you very much. But, I totally agree with you in terms of the fact that Africa having 4% contribution presently will have the opportunity to do it right for the future. And but I tell you what, the politics involved, a lot of these Western nations, they talk from both sides of their mouth, and when it comes right down to doing the right thing for Africa, they do the wrong thing. And to compound that, we have political leadership that is so bad, so corrupt, that they can even sell their country to any person who wants to buy their country. So that is the gospel truth as far as the reality and the challenges that you face. And I don't know what can be done. The example you gave as far as producing fossil fuel, thinking that it's going to help economic development of the people, raise their per capita income, increase economic welfare, but it is not. If you just go to Nigeria, where I'm from, in the Delta region, I mean, the challenge for the local, Nigerians is huge, and the level of economic development, the level of economic welfare is still very low. Per capita income is very low. So it doesn't translate to economic development or perhaps economic welfare. It translates to enrichment of these few politicians who are ready to, I guess, sacrifice their nation for their own personal gains. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you, Jim.
Thank you, Franklin. Would anybody else like to raise a question or write it in the chat box? Agnes, go ahead. Oh, you're muted.
Vanessa, it's so good to have you. Thank you so much for your presence this afternoon. We are so delighted that you were able to make it today. And I think that one of the things that you talk about is political will. If there's political will, everything is possible. I'd like you to talk a little bit more about the activism across African countries, because it appears that at least some of us who are outside tend to hear more about the activism during times of conferences, like global conferences. And could you speak a little bit more about, the activism on the ground, the voices on the ground, maybe the challenges that you have, but also regionally across the region of Africa? How is that working out? Do you have groups getting together, empowering yourselves? And, what is the climate like in terms of people trying to get their voices across? And we value your voice, but we tend to hear much more. The voices, of course, get louder as the conferences come on. But can you speak a little bit more about the voices on the ground and, what impact you're making, and, connections and, connections across regions of Africa?
Thank you very much. Well, I'll start by talking about the group that I work with. I work with the Rise Up movement, and it's a group that I started in 2020 to help amplify the voices of activists across the African continent, because I was seeing the challenge that many of us were facing to, to get their voices listened to and heard and even platformed. I believe every activist has a story to tell, and every story has a solution to give, and every solution has a life to change. But we may never get to know, those solutions, to hear those stories, if there is no platform, if there is no one amplifying them. So yes, there are different African activists that are working together in different groups to raise awareness about the environmental issues and concerns in their countries, but also some of the, the global concerns. Many times we are called missing voices, but we are not missing. We are speaking. We've been, speaking for, so many years. But it's not even just us. There've been voices, that have been there before us, like the late Wangari Maathai from Kenya, who has inspired many of us. So it's really understanding that, climate activism or environmental activism, it's not a new thing on the African continent, because many people think that, activism is a Western thing, or, they don't really see it as, it has been idealized to be a Western thing and not for people from the global South, of people from Africa. But when I think about, my growing up, I realized how much, we lived our lives so sustainably, how, our parents actually ensured that we live our lives so sustainably. We didn't have a term for it. Probably my mother never knew the word sustainability. I'm not sure if she knows it right now, but when you look at the things that she would tell us to do, and then you think about them right now, you realize how actually they were contributing to the well-being of, our planet. And it starts with, small things like if you leave food for lunch and you don't finish your lunch, then you have to keep it and eat it later in the evening for supper. I saw that in my family with my parents. I believe that it cuts across many families in Uganda, or even probably Africa, that we just grew up knowing that, we cannot waste food. We weren't told that, this is something sustainable. This is something that in the end ensures the protection of our environment and reduces wastage. But we just grew up doing it because our parents kept on telling us that. It's those things of knowing that, your parents will get you, a new cloth, maybe at the end of the year for Christmas, but then you realize later on that actually they were being sustainable, because you're seeing how much fast fashion is harming our planet, and how, it's harming the garment workers that have to go through, difficult working conditions to make the clothes that we wear. So you start to realize that actually my mom is ensuring that, I get a new cloth at the end of the year. She didn't have a term for it, but to her, you realize later on that it was sustainability. So I think it's really important for people to understand that sustainability has always been a part of our cultures, in our families, in African countries. It has always been a part of us. And when it comes to the different youth voices that are organizing across Africa, one thing that I've seen about, the different young people across Africa, they're not just, going on the streets when they're able to. They're not just using their platforms on social media, but they're also carrying out different grassroots projects, to transform their communities. I've seen tree planting projects in schools, in communities that are being carried out by different activists in Africa. The Vashwin Schools project that I work on with different activists to bring solar and clean cooking stoves, women and girl empowerment projects, because you realize that actually many African activists are doing so much work in transforming their communities. They're not just speaking on global stages, but they are working with their communities, they're transforming and growing, with their communities. And I think the challenges that we've seen or experienced as activists from Africa, even the global conferences that have been mentioned, it's always a challenge for many African activists to get to those conferences for issues of funding, even access to accreditation. If we are to talk about, the COPs, the most recent one was in Egypt. The next one will be happening in the UAE. So these climate conferences, when we see African activists there, it's actually a lot of work of these very activists working to ensure that they get accreditation, they have access to funding to be able to go and, tell the stories and experiences of, their communities. So I think that is one of the challenges that I've seen, the challenges to attend these conferences, issues with visa. We saw it with the, the Bonn Climate Conference that is happening right now in Germany. Many activists from, Africa that had to be there weren't able to make it because of the, the hard visa processing. And I mean, this has happened at different climate conferences. So I think it's a challenge for many, activists from Africa. And I also think that, the other challenge that many activists face is scaling up and the resources, not just financial resources, but also technical, the different resources that are needed to scale up their projects in communities. I think that that is a challenge that so many activists in Africa face, and also a challenge of actually having registered organizations. We struggled with that for like 2 years to actually be, registered. So I think it's a challenge that many activists face to actually have their, their groups registered legally. And this, of course, limits the amount of support that they get towards their work. So I think, there could be more challenges, but those are some that I can, mention right now.
Thank you. Thank you, Vanessa. Thank you for sharing this wide range of challenges and also the strategies that you work on. Dr. Taiwo, who is also our next speaker, has his hand up. Dr. Taiwo.
Yeah, thanks, Elsa. Thanks, Vanessa, for that presentation and for your thoughtful answers so far. I wanted to follow up on the point Franklin made. So it seems like a lot of what you've brought up have been barriers for the participation of activists in a lot of these important conversations and getting platforms to get your messages out. And all of that seems important, but it seems different maybe from having like political leverage over these conversations and over the decisions that get made by state officials or by the UN or by the World Bank or any of these sorts of institutions. So I'm just, so my question is, from your perspective as an activist, from your fellow activist perspective, what are the ways of challenging these authorities, these politicians, besides messaging, that you think are most promising? Is it building alliances with trade unions on the continent? Is it building alliances with particular state officials in, maybe the countries that are most harmed and might have the most reason to push the UN in one direction or other? What's the power story from your perspective?
Thank you very much. Well, I would say that we need every piece of the puzzle, first of all. That means we need everyone involved. You know, we need the activists, we need the people working in government, we need the people working in courts, we need the people, you know, working in schools. It's really, I think it's about us mobilizing as many people as possible in every sector of our lives, because I believe that the people of the power is, the power of the people is greater than, you know, the people in power. We've seen activists go to court, and we've seen court cases that are, you know, being led by activists on fossil fuel companies. So you can ask me, what is, you know, what is the place of lawyers or courts or judges, or the place of the law in the environmental movement? I think it's pretty clear that therein is their place to support the different court cases that activists bring. You know, when you talk about schools, you think about maybe teachers, you think about lecturers, you think about professors. What is their role? I think that will bring in the perspective of climate education or environmental education. You know, when I was studying business, I didn't really get the reality of what was happening on the ground. I got to know about this through my own, you know, research and trying to understand some of the challenges that the people in Uganda were facing. And that's when I got to know about climate change, and I was really, you know, interested to learn more about it. So it's been a journey of educating myself, but also learning from those who have gone ahead of me and those who have more, you know, wisdom and knowledge on the issue than I do. So that is how I've been able to learn most of the things that I know, or even, you know, talk about when it comes to climate spaces. But there could have been, you know, a teacher who should have taught me that, or a professor or a lecturer who would have made me see the reality of, you know, this crisis. But if we, you know, if we have more people in education institutions, be it schools or colleges, helping people understand that the environment needs to be protected, I think that would also be helpful. So I think it's really mobilizing everyone. I always say not everyone will go to the street, but everyone can add, you know, can add activism on whatever they're doing. If they're teaching, or if they're doing law, or if they are, you know, accountants, or, you know, marketers. Many times, you know, people say that, you know, I always say I did marketing, but then I haven't actually done a lot of it, you know, in the business world. But then people always say that, but actually you're using some of your marketing without even knowing to actually create awareness about the climate crisis and get people to know, to use every platform to say climate change is here, but also the solutions that we need are here. So without even realizing, I'm actually using what I learned, you know, through marketing to actually talk about climate change without realizing that. So I think we just need to mobilize more people to know that they can do whatever they can in their spaces to contribute to the climate movement. I work, you know, with some activists who work within government delegations, official delegations for some of these climate conferences. I've never been a part of an official delegation. I work with some activists who are like negotiators, who work as negotiators within, you know, the UNFCCC processes and the climate conferences, the COPs. So you realize that, you know, there are different ways that all of us can get involved. I think it's really getting your part. You know, there are doctors, there are nurses. We know how the climate crisis is also a health crisis. What is causing, you know, the rise in global temperatures, the burning of fossil fuels? It is the same thing that is causing air pollution, which is harmful to, you know, to our health, to so many people. We are seeing, you know, what is happening in New York with the wildfires, you know, in Canada. We are seeing how this could impact, the lives of so many people because of the air quality. So if we also have like more doctors, more nurses saying that actually the burning of fossil fuels is a threat to the health of not only the economies, but also the health of our people. More people are getting sick. If you have more people actually carrying out research that, shows that, when there is more burning of fossil fuels, the air quality gets worse and more people get sick with respiratory diseases. So, I mean, it's huge. It's really understanding that we need to mobilize everyone. And we don't need to tell everyone to go on the street, but we can't tell everyone to use whatever they're doing to address this, this issue. It's understanding that when we bring all those pieces together, the pieces of the puzzle, that is what completes the puzzle. If one part of the puzzle is missing, it will never be complete. So we just have to find a way of fitting all these puzzles together to address one challenge that actually intersects with so many sectors of our lives. Because when you talk about climate change, you talk about how it's exacerbating poverty. You talk about how it's accelerating, hunger in communities, insecurity, conflicts because of the depleted resources. So environmental issues are actually issues that affect every sector of our lives. That in the end, if we don't address the climate crisis, we may never fully address poverty eradication, achieving zero hunger, ensuring that our communities are safe, ensuring that girls, go to school and finish school. We've seen and read articles that have talked about how, the number of the rates of children dropping out of school, especially girls, increases as climate disasters increase as well. And also how many girls are forced into early marriages. In some countries, when their families experience climate disasters, we've seen some countries, some families force their girl children into marriage because they expect a bride price, which bride price can help them recover from the climate impacts. So it's really trying to understand and bringing all these things together and know that the challenge that we are addressing right now, it doesn't stand alone. It affects every other challenge of, that could affect humanity or the lives of people. So we know that if we are addressing the climate crisis, we are addressing poverty, we are addressing hunger, we are addressing, girl marriages, we are addressing dropping out of school, we are addressing insecurities in societies. So we just have to mobilize as many people as possible and also mobilize the people in government, because many times they're the ones in the rooms where, decisions are being made, they're the ones who put signatures on the different documents. So we have to mobilize them as well and hold them accountable when it comes to addressing climate change.
Thank you,
Yes, sir.
Vanessa. And thank you for that question, Dr. Taiwo. Raj, I'll turn it over to you.
No, I just have a question for Vanessa.
Okay, yeah, go ahead. Ask your question.
Vanessa, for the most part, America is a country of middle income, with families having 3,000-4,000 square feet houses, 2 cars. What would you tell these people to abandon their current lifestyle and go back to the lifestyle that most people in Africa have? And if so, how would you convince them to transition from the lifestyle of this luxury, which is a linear yardstick for measuring economic development?
Well, I would say that many times, people think that we as activists, we are telling people what to do, especially, individuals, we are telling people what to do and what not to do. And we don't want to do that. We want to talk about what governments need to do. We want to talk about what corporations need to do, because in the end, it is not individuals that are causing oil spills in our, water sources. It is not individuals that are burning and destroying forests. I think it really goes back to individual responsibility. I think it should be a decision that is taken by the individual themselves. And I've actually seen people change without being told to change. Because when you educate people and they see the challenge, they see how they can contribute individually, I think that is more powerful, for individuals, because in the end, it is not individuals that are dropping, oil in our, water sources. It's not individuals that are, causing this massive air pollution. It is corporations, it is governments that are, supporting these corporations in continuing with business as usual. We just need to really educate people and then allow them make decisions. I think that is what makes, decisions made by people more sustainable. If it really comes from the person themselves, I think that would make it more sustainable than it being performative. I think it's important that, we avoid creating, performative situations in individuals, even in activist spaces. It can create, a space of gatekeeping, and people feel like, oh my God, if I am doing this, that means I cannot be part of the movement. I cannot do this. But I've seen that, within the movement, there is a transformation that just happens, and you decide as a person that I won't do this anymore. I won't do this anymore. And also it goes back to our governments making our cities more sustainable. When it comes to transportation, if there is more sustainable and more affordable transportation, could be through trains or trams. I've seen that in Europe. I think that people just realize that there is no need for them to have a car if they have, affordable
Or alternative means of
accessible.
transportation.
Yes, so I think that we need our governments to make people live more sustainably through investing in, public transportation that allows people to have, to live as sustainable as they want to be.
Your focus is on education, increasing awareness so that people will talk to their governments and request the change that they want.
Yeah, I've seen that, when you say don't do this, people actually never don't do stuff. They actually do it more. But I think that if you show them, if you show them the why of why they should do the good stuff, I think people just decide, and that is more sustainable. Because when you say don't, people are going to perform, and it won't be durable. It will just be for a short amount of time, because it will be like they were forced into doing that. But when you show people, when you educate people about a better way of life that is more sustainable, that is more thriving, not just for a specific group of people, but for, everyone on the planet, I think people can make decisions, by themselves that would be more sustainable.
Thank you for answering that question. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Thank you
But,
so much,
Vanessa,
Yes.
if I may, also, are you going to ask a question?
I was, but go ahead, Agnes.
Okay, I was just going to say, Vanessa, you are speaking here to a group of professors, college professors, who teach at different levels at the universities. What 3 things, for instance, would you want them to bring to the classroom in terms of supporting your work and in terms of, being cautious of the movements and what they can do? What 3 things, for instance, do you think we need to bring to our classrooms?
Well, first of all, it's an honor to know that I'm speaking to professors. Thank you very much for that opportunity. And I think that, when it comes to what you can do, it's always hard to point out 3 things.
Well, whatever you can.
It almost sounds like 3 steps to getting rich overnight, but
just any ideas that you think we need
Yeah.
to bring to the classroom to keep
Yeah,
the
I think-
conversation alive.
Yeah, I think that we need more of the stories and experiences of those on the front lines of the climate crisis. And I think that it's just important for people to know that you know, many times people ask the question of, is it too late, you know, to address the climate crisis, or is it too late for us? But many times that question is asked from a place of privilege, even when the person doesn't know that they're speaking from a place of privilege. Because if you say, is it too late? The question is it too late for whom? Because the climate disasters have already impacted so many people. They, you know, there is no moment we are waiting for to see catastrophic events. If there is starvation, you know, happening in the Horn of Africa, or malnutrition, it shows that people are already suffering right now. That is why we need the voices of those on the front line. So I would say, you know, using whatever opportunity to amplify those on the front lines. It can be in spaces like this. It can be in, you know, sharing some of their material, as study material. It could be books that have been written by activists from Africa, or generally activists from the global South. And also, you know, for the different challenges that activists face, you know, with accreditation of funding to climate conferences, many times, you know, people always know people that have accreditation or people that could support environmental movements. So I think it's that would also be another way that, you know, can be helpful. But it really goes back to having the voices of those who are on the front lines of the crisis, but also on the front lines of the fight for climate justice.
Thank you very much, Vanessa.
Vanessa, unfortunately, our time with you has come to an end, but it is with a very, very big filled heart and mind and ideas for action, and a spirit for action, and a spirit for activism and disruption of the status quo that we are leaving this session with you. Thank you so tremendously much for spending this time and illuminating us with your energy and your courage, especially. I'm dropping a link in the chat box that also includes many interviews with you, Vanessa. So as you're bringing this content to your classroom, the film that we showed today is linked on there. Several interviews of Vanessa and also other climate change activists on the continent and in the United States are included. There's some teaching activities and so on and so forth. So do check it out. Again, Vanessa, I'm gonna do a live applause here for you. Thank you for joining us from Kampala, Uganda. And the internet held up, which was just wonderful. So thank you.